So my presentation is on integration, a kind of integration in society of people who have come in from outside, integrating refugees and migrants mainly from Ukraine, compatriot resettlement in Russia and Poland. Somebody, can you control the slide? Next, okay. So this is just a representation of Russia's GDP so that we can see how it relates to or correlates with some of these programs. I'm just going to move myself out of the way. So we'll see that that for Russia, and I'm going to talk about Russia first, the Compatriot Resettlement Program began in 2006-07 when the economy was growing very rapidly. It was revived after very limited success in 2012 and 2013, and then again slowed down in 2015. So we can see, first of all, that the course of the program, the efforts to recruit people into the Compatriot Resettlement Program partly follows the trends in the economy. Next. So compatriot resettlement programs were initiated in both Russia and Poland in the years 2006, 2007. Just to give you a sense of the scope, up to 2018, almost 900,000 people had passed through Russia's program, 200,000 in Poland, and in both cases, the majority of people were Ukrainians. In fact, Poland had an earlier program, and Russia had a first phase of the Compatriot Settlement Program before 2013, and neither of them had very much success. So the people that in the end they resettled were mainly people who would otherwise have been refugees or migrants, stateless migrants, possibly from Ukraine. But these programs do privilege migrants with ethno-cultural closeness and historical ties to the countries in which they're being incorporated. I just want to say that these kinds of programs are not new. Germany has followed this practice for a very long time. Israel, Kazakhstan, and a number of other countries have had similar programs. Okay, so next slide. So this isn't something that's particular just to Russia and Poland or just to post-communist states. They're much more widespread, but it's been very difficult for countries to have success with these programs. Israel has had a lot of success. It's a kind of special case. Germany has had some, but in most countries, success has been limited. So, in which the time my presentation asks and answers 4 questions. What are compatriot resettlement programs? That is, what do they involve? What motivates them? Why do governments adopt them? Who comes? What are the number, gender mix, ages, education? Do people come with families or without? There are different mixes of migrants, of all migrant trends. And both of these programs in particular, in the sense that they include many families, and that actually families are recruited, people, preferably people with skills or education, with children or with families, are specifically invited to these programs because part of their goal is to bring in skilled workers who are needed, but part of their goal for both countries is also demographic. It is to increase the numbers of people, and so it makes perfect sense to have families and to have children come as well. This is rather unusual. In most immigration programs, it's very difficult for people to bring their families. It typically takes a lot of time, often many years. And these programs are different as integration programs in the sense that they encourage whole families to resettle and not to break up families. How are these groups integrated into society and labor forces? Do they have legal status? Do the societies accept them? What is their work status? And a little bit, we'll talk at the end, why are citizenship rights increasingly defined in ethno-cultural rather than civic terms? Okay, next slide. Okay, So introduction, no, okay. What are the programs? In Russia, many of you probably know, and I should say, and we'll say at the end, I very much appreciate your comments, criticisms, suggestions, either here or through email. So state program of voluntary resettlement to the Russian Federation that should be of compatriots abroad was, the first program was from 2006 to 2012. It was mainly, but not strictly or exclusively, geared to ethnic Russians. Any person with historical ties to the current Russian Federation could apply to the program. Russian speakers with cultural ties to Russia, especially those from the Commonwealth of Independent States. So compatriot was a flexible term. It didn't mean only Russian, it wasn't only ethnic, it was definable in a number of different ways. But for the first 6 years, only about 80,000 people were repatriated, some from the Commonwealth of Independent States, some from other places. There was a group of old believers from Latin America who returned under this program. It was open to Russians and people who had a history with the Russian Federation all over the world from the beginning. Okay, next slide. Okay. So this program was then revived. It was not a huge success, but it was revived in 2012 and 2013 for another 3 years. And in this stage, there was specified regional relocation programs, or programs of priority settlement. There are regions of Russia that had, after the transition, undergone depopulation, often regions in the east. They weren't poor regions, but they were regions that were sort of, had something of a poverty of sufficient skilled workers in labor forces. And people who went to these programs, to these priority settlement these priority settlement regions, were given additional advantages, relocation and temporary living stipends. They could coordinate relocation with employers in the region. They had state guarantees of social support for participants and families, vocational guidance, training, access to all levels of education. So these people who came as compatriot resettlers, there was really an effort to integrate them into the society and to help them make the transition to the new places in which they were living. There was a lot of support provided by the state and really by communities as well. Next. Okay, so this is a table that shows you the number of registered participants of the state program and members of their families in the Russian Federation from 2007 to 2019, in thousands of people. And you can see that in the early years from 2007 to 2011, 12, the numbers of people are increasing, but they're relatively moderate. And then from 2014, when large numbers of people begin to come from Ukraine because of the conflict and lack of employment, the numbers increase very rapidly in 2014, 2015, 2016, and even into 2017 and 18, the numbers are considerably higher than they were before. You can see also from the first set of statistics is the actual participants, the family member who applied to and was included in the program. And then underneath that, from the participants' family members, and often the numbers of family members was larger than the number of participants. That is, there was several members in the family, all of whom could be included. So you see the program became much more successful. And again, it was an inclusive program in the sense that it brought in and supported whole families, which is quite unusual, I think. Okay, next for programs for people migrating to a state. Inflow from Ukraine was a major factor. Beginning in 2014, Russophone Ukrainian citizens became the majority of compatriots who were coming to Russia. And the main reason for the sharp increase and really success of the state program brought in almost 1 million people over these years. The program became a way to provide temporary residence permits and fast track to Russian citizenship for those from Ukraine. Most people were given temporary asylum status as a first stop or a first step, would be step, and then many of them moved into this Compatriot resettlement program. So again, this was a very constructive integration program for groups of people that in other situations are often spend long years in refugee camps or families are separated. And so this program, the Russian Federation and Poland too, are rather reluctant to give people asylum, full asylum, because it produces a lot of responsibility for the states. And this program became a way to serve several different sets of interests, which I'll come to next, both interests of Russian society and state and interests and needs of the people who were coming in. Okay, next. Okay, this, I just wanted you to see, I mean, one of the things that happens in this program is, of course, it's very helpful for Ukrainian migrants. It's very unhelpful for the other groups of migrants, both the Central Asian workers in Russia and also the people who come in from Syria, most of whom do not get even temporary asylum. So this is for, in December 2018, the numbers of persons with temporary asylum in the Russian Federation, and you can see that Ukrainians are the vast majority, 96%. There's small numbers from Syria, Afghanistan, and other countries. And very often people were given temporary asylum right away, and then they could apply to and move through the Compatriot resettlement program, or perhaps join relatives or otherwise. So, okay, one more slide. And this shows the numbers of refugees in the Russian Federation. Again, this is a small number of people. The total is only about a little over 570. Those people are mostly from Afghanistan, from the war in Afghanistan. They've had refugee status for a while. The second largest group is from Ukraine. And these were usually people who had, because of their specific political or military activities, had very compelling reasons to argue that they would be persecuted, that their lives would be at risk if they didn't have permanent status in another country. A small number from Georgia, and then the blue is other countries, which means I'm not sure what other countries. Some of these people are probably from Syria, but they're also from a mix of other countries, and it's not clear when they came. So the number of people with temporary status is much larger, and they will move on from that status to a different political or civil status. Okay, next. So what motivates Compatriot resettlement programs? This is probably fairly obvious. First of all, patriotic motives, the sense that it's good and necessary to bring the nation together. This was the same in Poland, to give people who have an historical attachment to the nation the possibility to come back. They're somewhat humanitarian, but there's a sense that as a nation, Russia has the responsibility to bring together the nation as long as people want to come. These are all voluntary programs. Economic, the needs of the labor market, especially in eastern regions of the country. This somewhat limits the free choice of residence of people joining the program, because they have to find a place, a republic or region that's willing to take them. And then, of course, there's the demographic issue. Immigration is going to be the main source of population stabilization and growth. Pronatalist programs also could contribute, but both of them are really needed. Politically, this was a way to resettle displaced refugees from the conflicts in Ukraine. And ideologically, it represented something of an ethnic turn in nation building, which we see in many states in all parts of Europe and other regions of the world. Okay, next. Now this was a a set of statistics that were generated a long time ago. They're projections, but they are the kinds of projections that to which Russian policymakers had access when they adopted these programs, both the initial one and the second one in 2012. So you see the population would increase a little and then probably decline, but more specifically, the working age population would undergo serious decline from about 2010 to 2019. And that is the period in which the Compatriot programs were especially successful in bringing in people to fill in gaps in the labor force. One more. Okay. This 2012 concept of state migration policy, this was the second phase. One of the common claims made was one of the country's main tasks is facilitating and stimulating resettlement of patriots to Russia for permanent residency. And this will be one of the differences between the Russian and the Polish program. Polish program is really a settlement program. Wants people to come to Russia and settle down and hopefully stay permanently. And they get many privileges and advantages that make it easier for them to do that. Who are the resettlers? There was a preference for educated and skilled people. In some regions, an explicit preference for families with children, guaranteed support, healthcare, and education. I don't have a very a better picture of exactly who the resettlers were. These were the kinds of specifications that regions made when they were recruiting people for this program. But I hope to learn more about who they are. Okay, one more. New barriers to other ethnic migrants from the Commonwealth of Independent States in MENA, which is Middle East, North Africa, the refugees from the Syrian war and other countries. So people from the Commonwealth of Independent States till 2015 could enter Russia freely on internal passports. In 2015, just as the Compatriot settlement program is having real success, and the economy is not doing spectacularly well, the barriers are, there are a little more, barriers are made a little bit higher for other people coming into Russia to work. External passports were required. Many people wanted to require visas for those from Central Asia and other countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States, but the government did not require visas. It required certification of Russian language for work permits, except for qualified specialists. Very few from the Middle East and North Africa were given refugee status, as we saw in the earlier slides, or temporary asylum. Some of this is connected with the sort of Islamophobia and negative attitudes toward Muslim migrants. But I want to point out that besides the fact that Russia's largest minority is Muslim, this is not something that is inherited from historical times. Refugees from Afghanistan were taken by Russia. Refugees from Chechnya were taken by Poland in an even later period. So I just want to point out that the more negative attitude toward migrants from Islamic societies is relatively recent. Political contexts are different. The majority of Russians support these restrictions and preferences, partly because of terrorist attacks. That changes the political context in people's attitudes, unfortunately, toward everybody from the group. Okay, more. Okay, how are people integrated? Legal and civil status, people had rapid access to temporary asylum, temporary and permanent residence, citizenship after 1 year. In many of the famous bureaucratic barriers, legs, long periods to have paperwork processed, it was really an effort to cut all of this short for these people and to process papers and statuses for them quickly. Societal opinion polls show that 50% of the people polled agreed that Russian and Russian-speaking immigrants should be accepted, even if entry of others were restricted. Large campaigns were organized by the government and civil society to help these people settle. 14% of Russia's population in one survey said that it had been involved in activities to aid these migrants. And in the labor market, people had the right to work legally outside of quotas, though regions were not always enthusiastic about taking them because it had to provide for their social well-being. And there's really, and if any of you knows about any sources, I'd be happy to learn about them. There seems to be no information about what actually happens to people after they resettle, whether they stay, whether once they get citizenship, they move to other parts of Russia, whether any of them go back to Ukraine or other countries. We really don't know. Okay, we have a few minutes for Poland. Poland's repatriation program, called the Poles Card. It was also initiated in 2007 by the Law and Justice Party, not a surprise. It was initially for those of Polish descent only from the 15 states of the former Soviet Union and provided visas and travel benefits. There was no requirement of settlement though. People could apply for a Poles Card as long as they could show that they had Polish descent, they could get it. And this would make it easier for them to travel back and forth to Poland, but they weren't required to settle. They were encouraged though, for settlers, there was financial support for their families for 9 months, free university education, and the right to work without a visa. And in 2013, the rights of those who settled in Poland were expanded to a permanent resident card on arrival, citizenship after a year of settlement. And in 2019, this program was extended to people of Polish heritage all over the world, not only in the region. So this was a program that started out a little broader in its scope with fewer requirements, but increasingly it moved toward encouraging people to come and live permanently in Poland. Next slide. One more slide, okay. The motivations on the whole were similar to those in Russia. They were patriotic and humanitarian. Demographically, Poland has the same issues with low birth rates. It also has large-scale emigration of young people to EU states, mainly in Germany. Hundreds of thousands of young educated Polish people have gone to the EU to work for higher wages and better conditions. And this has really exacerbated the demographic crisis in Poland, produced even a kind of existential crisis that the nation is fading away. And so this program is a way to try to address some of those problems. And economically, it wasn't to move people to targeted regions as it was in Russia, rather to increase legal employment of foreigners with skills who could easily adapt to Polish society. Okay, one more. Who were the migrants? Again, the explicit goal was to attract families. And again, people from Ukraine, families from Ukraine were a large part of the people who joined the program. 90% of the 200,000 people who were recruited came from Ukraine and Belarus. So most of them were quite local in areas where Polish populations had moved back and forth historically. At the beginning, they were evenly men and women, and later more men. Many of the women, when they came, one member of the family, usually the man, would actually be registered in the program. But many women who came either with their families or by themselves engaged in care work in both Poland and Russia. And this kind of work tends generally to be in informal sectors and provides less security for people and fewer social benefits than legal employment. Okay, one more. Okay, integration. Again, they had a legal status, very much like in Russia, fast track to rights and citizenship. Societal attitudes, I'll show you a slide in a minute, but the majority declared the presence of Ukrainian migrants to be positive, a large majority. I just want to point out again that Poland did take tens of thousands of people from Chechnya, and several thousand settled in Poland in 2003, 2004, and this was done without sort of upsurge of Islamophobia. Again, the political context is different, but I want to just highlight that this is something of a change. There's very strong preference for co-ethnics. Labor markets, many still work in the informal economy, including most women. And in Poland, more so than in Russia, social benefits now, including healthcare, depend on legal employment. So some are excluded from from social benefits. In Poland, even citizenship does not give people, in Russia, citizenship gives people access to healthcare, rights to healthcare. In Poland, it doesn't anymore. Insurance has to be paid. The state pays for unemployed and people outside of the labor force, but people in the labor force who are not in formal employment are left without health benefits. And that's been a real problem for many of the women. Okay, one more, just almost done. These are just a couple of attitude. There are two panels. This was a survey that was designed to measure people's attitudes toward different groups of immigrants. Do you agree that Poland should accept Ukrainian refugees? And the two green areas, the strongly agree and moderately agree, are well over 50% of the population is in favor of accepting Ukrainian refugees and migrants. And then one more. And then this is, do you agree that, no, I'm sorry, back to the back one. They look the same, but they're different. Okay, do you agree that Poland should accept some of the refugees coming from the Middle East and Africa to Europe? And here you see a much smaller group agrees that these people, some of them should be taken. And the size of that group declines over time. In 2015, it's 45%, but by a few years later, it's declined to much less than that, to 25%. So the rest of the people agree or strongly agree or don't. Okay, one more. We're just at the conclusion. Conclusion, there is a turn toward ethnic or co-ethnic preference versus a civic concept of citizenship. This is a decision not only of the states, but clearly the attitudes of the opinions of people in the populations also follow this strongly. Russian Federation is a multi-ethnic state. Civil and social rights in the past have been ethnically neutral. The largest minority is Muslim. The Compatriot resettlement program is technically open to all with historical ties to the Russian Federation. So there's a kind of test of this. Circassians from Syria have come back to Russia and claim compatriot status. They do have historical ties. It's an interesting question whether they will qualify. Many of them have been given temporary asylum, but I don't think it's really resolved whether they are compatriots or not. Poland has been ethnically homogeneous since the end of World War II, but not so close to other ethnics. Besides Chechens, the government initially agreed to take 7,000 of the Mideast North Africa migrants through the European Union program, but then the Law and Justice Party won the next election, and they said no, they weren't taking any MENA migrants, but they were helping refugees from Ukraine, and they wanted culturally similar people who would blend into their society. I think there might be one more, but maybe that's enough. Okay, so these are policies of selective inclusion. Pronatalism, I think, has similar goals. The formal policy of the language, the formal language used in this legislation is sometimes civic, российских, sometimes ethnic, русский, and it's not entirely clear which identity or which concept of citizenship is the operative one. Okay, that's all.
Thank you very much, Linda. It was a very interesting and comprehensive analysis and a very moving presentation. I have some questions, and I hope my colleagues also would like to ask you. First of all, let me ask you about the very recent changes in statistics of actually in processes of migration. According to the official statistics, in 2019, the number of migrants coming from Ukraine for the first time in this in recent history was less than the number of migrants from Tajikistan. What you did not compare, I think, migrants, position of migrants and their issues from Ukraine and Tajikistan in Russia. Right. And what do you think? What the perspective would be for Ukrainian migrants in the next few years? Will this number continue to decrease, and what will happen to the Tajikistan migrants?
So you're saying that this is the first time that the number coming from Tajikistan is larger than the number coming from Ukraine. Well, I think first of all, a substantial number of Ukrainians have those from Ukraine have resettled in Russia and in Poland and possibly also in other countries. Hungary is also offering passports to people with Hungarian roots from Ukraine, and I believe Slovakia is also doing that. So it may be that the people who were most affected by the conflict and wanted to escape it have already escaped. Tajikistan, I haven't looked recently at Tajikistan. I mean, there's a migration from Central Asia and Tajikistan. It comes from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and I should know this. In the largest numbers from Uzbekistan. So I imagine that the overall immigration from Central Asia is still is quite a bit, has been quite a bit larger all along. Many of these migrants are circular. So they come seasonally or they come for a while and then go back. They don't necessarily settle in Russia. So it's hard even to know how many there are, but I can't predict the future. I think if anyone ever thought they could predict the future, the coronavirus should have cured them of that belief. I don't know what will happen. I think maybe that many people from Ukraine have already basically moved to more stable places.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree that there are also other directions that are open for Ukrainian migrants, as you already mentioned, to Europe. Another question is about the geographical differences for this migration resettlement. Do you think what are actually the geographical locations or directions of these migration flows from Ukraine, for example, as you are studying this particular issue? Do they migrate throughout Russia, or in every region we can find these migrants, or mostly they resettle in capital cities? Thank you.
No, well, going through this program, it's very difficult for them to settle in capital cities. By the end of the program, 76 regions belonged to it, so there were a lot of places they could go, but the preference, the priority regions were mainly in the East. I have them somewhere and I can send them to you. But they could go to other regions, but the people settling had to have a link with an employer who wanted to employ them in a region that was willing to take them. They couldn't go just wherever they wanted. Now, later in the program, there were many more choices because many more regions participated. I don't think that the most recent article I read said that there is no follow-up for these settlers, but there are reports from a few regions that I haven't looked at yet. So it may be possible to get more of a sense. I believe that once they have citizenship, they can move as long as, you know, they can find I believe that they can move once they have citizenship, and that takes a couple of years.
Thank you.
Dear Linda, thank you very much for the interesting report. I have one question connected with the last part when you discussed the problems of state and ethnic nationalism. And can you explain maybe how does the status of repatriate, refugee, temporary resident affect the subjective well-being of migrants from Ukraine, in Russia, and in Poland? Because this question is connected with the differences of this nationalism in different understanding of nationalism in Russia and in Poland.
I don't really know much about subjective well-being, but I do want to emphasize that this attitudes toward other ethnic migrants are in many places. I mean, I think the Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union is partly because so many Polish migrants came, and the British didn't, even though they weren't very culturally different, the British felt like too many migrants had come. So it's a general problem. I wouldn't say quite universal, but in many countries, anti-immigration, you all know this, anti-immigration parties and movements are developing. I mean, subjective well-being is, I really can't, I really don't know about that. I know a little bit about it in Britain, but for these migrants, I don't know. Sorry.
Thank you. Colleagues, any others?
Yes, one more question. Thank you very much, Linda. It was very impressive presentation. My question is a bit close to what Marie just asked, but from another perspective. Do you have any evidence whether, I mean, in which country, in Russia or in Poland, societal institutions that need to show the acceptance of migrants on the ground level, I would say, for example, churches or communities, local communities, in which country in Poland or in Russia they are more prepared for working with these migrants and more welcome, I would say, those migrants, because of course employment and the status of people with employment is the most thing for the refugees and for the compatriots to settle and to feel fine in any region. But also it's very important how they are settled in terms of these, community relations, in terms of being accepted and welcomed at the different levels of institutions. So do you have any evidence from your research, or do you have any facts from others' research?
I have a little of both. I looked at survey data in both cases, and on the basis of opinion surveys, when Vetsium asks people, what do you think we should resettle people from Ukraine? In both countries, large majorities speak in favor. I know more about the efforts in Russia, especially when Ukrainians first began coming. There were many efforts by the government, by the civic council, and by local groups to help to collect clothing and other materials and to provide aid for the Ukrainians. I saw some of this on television last time I was in Russia. So I know much more about these programs in Russia now. Sometimes after the people had been here in Russia for a while, I've read some focus group results that show that though people are still in favor of having Ukrainians, sometimes they begin to be resentful about these people getting payments and help from the government and, sort of being overly demanding. But these are resentments. These are not the kinds of intense fear or opposition there are to other migrants. For Poland, except I only really know about the opinion polls, and opinion polls show high levels of acceptance. What actually happens at the community level, again, we'd have to trace people once they've been settled. And that I don't, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Do you all know about the Compatriot Resettlement Program? I mean, is that something you've read about or paid any attention to?
Yes, it's quite known, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you all very much. If you have any other comments or questions, please just email them.